Welcome to the 5 a.m. podcast, where we bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders and influencers who are making headway and definitely some waves in their callings. Today, we will meet a man who has come to embody resilience, persistence, and transformation. I was not expecting to discuss the weaponization of America's prison system and its harsh treatment of political prisoners. Perhaps one might say these people were not politically inclined or aligned with the power brokers of the time. Earlier this week, I spoke with Chris Burgard, who had made the documentary and the miniseries The War on Truth. From there, I wanted to speak with someone who had firsthand experience, or maybe a family member under the government's lock and key. And from what I've seen as a member of the public, the J6ers deserved the pardons they received, as they had not received fair treatment or due process. And who of us would want that to happen to their family members? Certainly not me. Well, our guest today is Shane Jenkins. Shane was a January 6th defendant. He was charged with 8 felonies, 1 misdemeanor, and he was sentenced to 84 months. It's 7 years, people. He was in 9 different prisons, and he was in what we're calling the DC Gulag for 32 months. That's almost 3 years of his life. Now, before we welcome our guest, I want to admonish those of you that are listening and watching to read 2 books. Propaganda by Edward Bernays and Gustave Le Bon. His book is called The Crowd. These 2 books will forever change your perception on what you see presented to you and how crowds react to influence and power. Shane Jenkins, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the 5 a.m. podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, I'm looking forward to this conversation. And I want to start by asking, has these last few years for you been a metaphor of a lot of things, whether physically or spiritually? And I want to know from, in your mind, what does it feel like to be pardoned and set free?
It has been it's been a lot the last 4 years being in jail, suffering, but I'm keeping up with politics and inflation and the porous border and the drag queen story hour and the fall in Afghanistan and all these things. And I think about, we're being destroyed in there, and I'm in there with a bunch of Marines, Rangers, Special Forces guys, professional career guys. I've been in trouble with the law, and I look like that. You know, I did time in Texas and gave my life to Jesus Christ in 2016. So I had some foreknowledge of what we were kind of going to be going through, but I had no idea the screws that were going to be put to us. So I was a good boundary for what was kind of normal under a jailhouse setting as opposed to what wasn't, because a lot of these guys had professional careers and never been in trouble before. So being in there was like, it was symbolic of the same suffering that was going on in the nation. And so, getting pardoned, that was the most surreal feeling. I remember listening to the inauguration on the radio. And then, wondering, I heard Trump go down to I guess he did the rotunda speech, and then he went down to a remote viewing spot where there was like 2,500 more people remote viewing in the Capitol. And he said there, they asked me not to talk about it in my inauguration speech, but he says there's going to be some very happy J6 people very soon. And I was like, okay, this could be, he didn't say exactly what, but that was probably around 2 or 3 p.m. And then at 6:30 p.m., a guard came to my door and he goes, Jenkins, he goes, where were you at on January the 6th? And I said, sir, I was at the Capitol. And he said, get your stuff. You're getting out of here. And I was like, dude, please don't play with me like that. Like I'm waiting to hear something. And I'm like, I thought he was playing with me. And I was like, please don't play with me like that. And he was like, Jenkins, get your stuff, whatever you're taking. I don't care about the rest of it. And get over here and put these handcuffs on. We're taking you out of here. And I was like, my cellie was like, get your stuff, get out of here. You're leaving. And I was just like, it was so surreal. They took me out of there about 6:30 p.m. I wasn't released until 1 a.m. in Terre Haute, Indiana. But they had to bring, it was Martin Luther King Day, was like inauguration day. So it was a federal holiday. None of the administrators were there to do any paperwork. So they had to call those people from home in the evening, no less. And they came and filled out the paperwork, and released me that following morning, Tuesday morning at 1 a.m. I went out in the cold snow. It was 3 degrees outside. And so, and I've since made it home to Houston, but it's still surreal. I looked the other day and it's been 3 weeks and it doesn't, I mean, it's absolutely blows my mind that I was just in federal prison less than a month ago.
Yeah, no kidding. So speaking of the guards and your cellie, what were the guards like to you and other J6ers?
Most, in the BOP, it was a little bit different. I'll backtrack back to the DC jail.
Yeah.
I will say that the run-of-the-mill guard, once we finally, because when we first got to DC, they put these, we call them the goon squad, the emergency response team, or the CERT team members. And those guys are like bigger and meaner and used to dealing very confrontationally with people. And so they had those guards as our regular station post guards, right? And there was 2 of them at a time when usually a pod would only have 1 officer. And so those guys were there and they were very brusque, very short with us, because if you think about what the media said, these guys are white supremacists, they're domestic terrorists, they called it the insurrection pod. This is the worst thing since the Holocaust, this is the worst thing since 9/11 or whatever whatever they wanted to compare it to. And so these guys some of them were professional, but other ones, it took us a long time to build a rapport with some of these guards. Eventually, they put regular guards in there, which mostly were from Africa, not African Americans, but from Africa.
Is that right?
And a lot of those people, they love Trump, and they are appreciative of America, and they love, but not the people that believe the Marxist, the division of America, that there was nothing ever great about America. And so it took us a long time to break down this barrier that we had between us. But eventually when we did, things were good, except for we had just regular officers working the pod. And you had like corporal, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, majors, and assistant warden. And a majority of those people were Black women. A lot of them were lesbians. And like 95% of them hated Donald Trump and hated us as a result. And so there was a lot of torture brought on us by those people. Physically, pepper spraying, physical attacks. They mandated that we wear COVID masks for probably, I want to say like the first at least 2.5 years we were in there.
Wow.
Way after COVID was over. They denied us under the guise of COVID protocols. They denied it because we refused to get vaccinated. They denied us visits for 2 years. They denied us religious services for 2 years. No communion, no chaplains, no nothing. And then they denied us haircuts the first year we were there.
Wow.
And so it was bad. They denied us lawyer visits from time to time. Some people were trying to get their discovery, which is basically their evidence that they could review for their trial. They would come in. They wouldn't sometimes let it get to us. Sometimes when we did get it, they would come in and shake the cell down or basically go through all of our stuff and take the evidence and say they didn't have it or they couldn't find it. And so, it was just a lot of obstruction, whether it was us trying to deal with our cases. They were denying us our basic treatment of human dignity and respect, and they were physically aggressive and violent with us from time to time.
Wow.
So,
and how about your cellmates and the other guys that were incarcerated?
now in the DC Gulag, it was all strictly January 6 guys.
Is that right? Okay.
We were all pretty good there. We had single cells, and I forget that you said that. Now that I think about it, we were single cell, but initially, coming into there, we were only coming out of our cell an hour a day.
Wow.
I remember when I first got to the DC jail, I was locked in a cell for 17 days straight. We were locked in our cells probably an hour. We only got to come out an hour a day for, I don't know, probably the first 6 months. And then maybe they bumped it up to 2 hours for the next 6 months. And then it was, they were splitting top tier. It was like the upstairs and then the lower tier. One would come out and they would go back in and then the bottom tier would come out and they would alternate days. But we were very limited in our time outside of a cell. And I don't know if you've ever raised a dog, but if you put a dog in a kennel and you just leave it in there and you only let it out for an hour a day and then you put it back in there, that dog, after a period of time, is going to be crazy. They're going to be running around, and they're going to, like, eventually they're not going to want to come out of there. And it just is really mentally difficult on us. So if you think about what that does to an animal, which is very much more limited in its thinking, imagine what that does to a human being. And so we suffered through solitary confinement for periods of time, as well as violence and denial of our rights and all these other things. So,
wow. So who are you now as a man compared to the one who was charged and sentenced?
Now I would say, I believe what I will say this. I believe that, and I said this in an interview on Cowboy Logic 2 years ago, and I believe that whether you agree with what I did on January 6th or whether you don't agree with it, like, God is bigger than all of this, right? He knows the beginning from the end of all of our lives. And so whether I messed up or I didn't mess up, God still is going to come in through that. And I say that, like, through this suffering, through this storm, that God is producing miracles through that. Whether I made a mess or whether I was righteous in what I did, God is still going to be right in the midst of it. And I know that there's nothing that Shane Jenkins can do that God can't grow through it and make it into something beautiful. And so I believe I'm still the same man of faith that I was before. I set my mind on creating a foundation while I was in prison. And so I wouldn't have done that had I been out. So I'm thankful for this time of suffering. I'm thankful for my January 6th family. So I have suffered being away from my children and my family and my friends, but God has also put these other people in my life that are now my family and my friends. And so
that level of community. And you mentioned the word storm, and I know in one of your pictures online you have that statement on your hat, "Into the storm." That's right. Can you describe the emotion and the thoughts behind that statement?
Well, and not to sound all quacky Christian-y, like, but I was seeing a vision of a little boy on this rock, and there was this wave crashing down around this child, right?
Yeah.
And that child was me. And I knew that there was something coming my way, and I didn't know what it was. I had a couple friends die 6 months before, and I knew something was happening. I had shared this with my mentor, and I'm not one to just frivolously throw around, I heard the voice of God, or I saw a vision from God, or these types of things. But I had a premonition, and I felt that, and I shared it with my mentor, and he bought me that hat, which is from Froning Farms. He's like I don't know what you call those HIIT training guys that do all those super intense workouts.
Okay.
But that's what the hat was. And the story behind the hat is when a storm comes, the buffalo face head first into the storm. And so that's what I knew, the storm was coming for me, and I didn't know what it was going to come as, but I knew that I needed to face it head on. And I believe the enemy tried to fool me, because in that vision of that giant wave crashing around that little boy, that was me, he was alone. But I know God told me, he said, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. So even in that, I used to be kind of intimidated by that wave crashing. I knew that God was with me through all of that. And I had to remember that maybe that was the enemy trying to deceive me, that I was going to be all alone. But in my trial through this storm of prison, I never once lost faith that God was walking with me. And so I was able to take this, what the enemy, the devil, meant to use to destroy me, and to use it to glorify God. And so that's what I've done with everything I've tried to do in there and out here. So
that's good. And another picture of that is with the buffalo facing and going into the storm. Where I live is kind of feedlot alley and ranch land. Okay. And one of the things that certain types of cows, like Herefords, like what we had on our farm, they'll go away from the storm, and then the whole crowd of them will get stuck up against a corner of the fence.
Oh no!
And they put their backs to the storm and try and walk away from it. Whereas the buffalo, like you're saying, we're gonna hit that storm head on. And you mentioned your children. How has your family, especially your children, been affected by your experiences, and how have they supported you through this journey?
My kids, like I said, I have a bit of a checkered past before I gave my life to Christ in 2016. And so I have spent time away from my children before, but they know the importance of this mission or this storm. And so they have been very supportive. We've been bonded very intentionally, regularly speaking. And so they're like, Dad, whether my oldest daughter doesn't necessarily agree with everything that I believe in politics, but she's like, Dad, the one thing I will say is I'm proud of you for standing up for what you believe in, and I support you 100%. So my children have gathered around me and embraced me and held me up through all of this. And so we have become closer. And for me, I'm trying to walk as an ambassador for Christ, but also that I'm going to walk in conviction in what I believe in and what I profess. I'm not just going to be like, oh, here comes the storm, I'm going to go be like those Herefords, and I'm going to go, it's rah, rah, rah. And then, when it gets tough, I'm going to go run over here and hide in the corner. That just can't be, I don't want to be that man and represent that to my children. So,
yeah. And if, the reason I mentioned those two books off at the start, Propaganda by Edward Bernays, he's the fellow, I believe, why we have orange juice for breakfast and have bacon and eggs for breakfast. That's the strength and power of propaganda. And the other book, The Crowd, it shows it's a little bit of a dry read. It's a very old book, but you read it and you think, wow, he's writing about what happened 4 years ago. He's writing about what we're seeing right now. The book, The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon. It's not very expensive. It's like $8 on one of the online shopping channels. So I'm not pushing the book. The reason I'm bringing that up is that picture of crowds. And we talked about the buffalo. We talked about the Herefords. Talked about the dog in the kennel. And we realize that if we understand what's being done to us and the messages that we're receiving and how people respond, then we know how we can lead and who to follow. One of the points in the book is a strong crowd, a mighty strong crowd, has a weak leader. And a strong leader has a weak crowd. The reason they're weak is because they have a strong leader and they don't have to be strong. And when the crowd sees a weak leader, then they know that they need to be strong, but they will still be influenced by the propaganda and the weak leader. So it is like that sentence or that saying of hard times make strong men, and strong men make good times, and good times make weak men, and weak men make bad times. So can you give us an idea of the level of supportive community that you experienced during your time under the government's lock and key?
Yeah, of course. Initially it was radio silent. Like, when we got in there, it was bad at first because nobody wanted to touch us with a 10-foot pole, and it was bad. And I'll never forget the first person that ever mentioned us was Vladimir Putin. And Joe Biden was giving him a hard time about what is the guy's name that they killed? Navalny, Alexander Navalny or Alexei Navalny, that eventually was killed in Russia or died in Russian prison, whatever. But he was saying something to Putin about having political prisoners in Russia, and Putin turned around and said, well, you've got those guys right there in D.C. that went to the Capitol to protest and present their grievance to the government, and then what do? You turn around and throw them all in prison. And so from that point forward, it just kind of was, we engaged, I don't want to say in propaganda because that seems like an underhanded term to use.
Yeah.
But we started engaging in a propaganda war. We started broadcasting our stories. We started writing letters to Congress people. We started writing our testimonies of what happened during our arrest, what happened on January the 6th, what we witnessed. Everybody intentionally started doing interviews on the thing. And while we're in there doing that, like, our families coalesced into Telegram groups. Wow. And then people started showing support through those, like joining those groups. And then we eventually had Mickey Whithoff come with the vigil outside the jail. And then there just grew to be these live streamers would show up at the vigil. And it just gradually grew and grew and grew. And we started singing the anthem in the jail, and people rallied behind that. And then it was just one thing after another. The American people embraced us, and we have a very solid, like, community that has gathered around and just kind of was, we had people on letter writing campaigns, the Patriot Mail Project.
Yeah.
They were putting our information out there so people could write us letters, and that was reinforcing us in there. And then we would write them back and encourage them out there. And it was just it's really something beautiful, and I'm blessed to be a part of it. It was hard going through all of it. We had really good days. We had really bad days, but we're blessed to have a supportive, wonderful J6 community. So
yeah, that's good. Were there some maybe misconceptions about other J6ers that you were in there with, that you could talk to us about and say, you might have heard this, but this was the reality?
There, and we haven't really hit on that too hard, but there were people that, and I look at myself because I don't, I have a criminal record, and like 99% of those guys don't have a criminal record. So I always wonder, well, people are going to be looking at me funny, but I think people we are called to bear fruit, right? Yeah. And I think that people, the tree, whatever kind of tree they are, if they bear bad fruit, that's evidence in and of itself.
Every seed produces after its own kind.
That's right. And so I believe that, there was some grifting going on. There was some of that type of stuff going on in there. And that's really kind of one of the reasons we started Stand in the Gap, was because to make sure, and you can't really tell because I'm in prison. I can't tell what's going on exactly, but I do know that whatever God entrusted me with, I'm going to be a good steward with it, and I'm going to do the right thing with it. I'm going to make sure anybody that works with me is going to make sure that whatever is allocated for this or that is exactly where it's going and all that. So I can't speak directly to those things. I just felt like we needed to be front and center in that conversation because we couldn't leave any room for error. And these men are being crushed. They're going through divorces. Their family members are dying off. Family members are testifying against them in court, their own children. They're losing homes, losing vehicles, losing businesses. And it was just like, it's too critical and too vital for us to stand on the sidelines,
Right. Yeah. So what were the two, was there two organizations that you've helped to start or that you work with?
Yes, sir. We started the realj6.com, or the Real J6, which is an LLC. And just we just sell gear. We were kind of getting guys' stories out. We were doing newsletters and stuff through the Real J6. And then we also started a nonprofit, called Stand in the Gap. It's standinthegap.foundation if you want to go to the website. But that right now we're helping January 6 families to get back on their feet. And we've got a few programs. We were doing Operation Love Wins when we finally did get visitation in the DC jail. We were paying for people's families to come to DC, paying for their flights, their room and board, their Ubers, some of their meals. Because after the dad's been gone for 2 years, the mom's been raising the kids. Like, she can't afford to take a day or two off to pay for airfare and do all this stuff to fly the kids and all this to come to DC for like a 1 or 2 hour visit and then turn around and fly home. It's just not feasible. So we were like, let's raise money and absorb that cost for these people so they can see their loved ones, for the men inside and for the people on the outside. And so we're kind of moving forward with that same theme, with something called Mission Memory Maker, where we're paying for like a 3 to 5 day vacation especially for the guy, mainly for the guys who are long-term incarcerated. So they don't have to worry about the vacation fees. We're going to pay for all that. But we're going to raise money around that and pay for people to go on a vacation to rebond the wives and the children and the family. So,
yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that absence of you're physically being prevented from seeing your family, and then having that first opportunity, maybe it's through a sheet of glass, or maybe it actually is in a room, but you can't have contact. Can you talk a little bit about that emotion?
Yeah, I mean, I can't talk about the obstruction, but what I will say is I'll never forget one of the first visits that we did have. Like, the visits in DC were contact visits, so we could hug our family and stuff.
Wow. Good.
But we got to see Billy Cressman's little girl get excited to see her dad and run and jump into his arms. And a lot of us that played a role in facilitating that and seeing that. It was just something that was beautiful. I got to see my brother and my children, and it's just something to be denied that for those years, and then to have them right before you. And it's hard. It would be like, having a long distance relationship with your kids, and then you're trying to be dad, still trying to speak into their life, still trying to be assertive as the father leadership role, but you're not there, and you don't really have necessarily that right because you're not there with them every day. And so you're intruding upon mom's authority, and you're not, and it's just kind of, the family's out of whack because dad's gone. And so, it's a whole trial in and of itself, but it's something that, thank God we're home. Thank God for President Trump pardoning us, and thank God that Jesus Christ is a redeemer, and he will restore all the things that the cankerworm destroyed. And we believe in that. We stand on the word of God that he is going to restore and redeem those relationships. So.
Yeah. That's great that you bring that up, because I want to ask you to elaborate maybe on spiritual changes or awakenings that you saw in people that you were incarcerated with.
Oh, yes. So I'm a part of a prison ministry here in Houston, and I gave my life to Christ at an event in prison in 2016 when this ministry, Charm Prison Ministry, came to see me in prison. So I know what it is to be in prison and to have an encounter with the master, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
and so I was fortunate enough to lead a Bible study in the DC jail for about a year probably. Wow. And two of my closest friends, Scott Fairlam and Robert Morris, Lego Man, just this last week, they were like, and I don't say this to brag, but they were like, man, they said, we give you the credit for our walk with Jesus Christ and our turning to the word of God and our faith. And so that, as a Christian, man, like, there's no greater compliment that you could give me is than to say, like, I'm not, I'm pointing to Jesus and everything. I try to point to Jesus in everything that I do. And so that Jesus would use me as a vessel to draw those men in is like the most. I was telling somebody last night, the pastor at the Bible study, and I was like, I said, if just one of those guys, if I had to go through all this over again, just for one of those guys to profess his faith and to walk with Jesus Christ, I would do it all over again. And so it was a blessing, even though through the suffering and all that, I would do it all again, because that's what this whole walk is about with Jesus Christ. So
it really is. You see the struggle that the shepherd has to go through to leave the 99 to reach that one lost sheep, right? So I want to ask you further to that, just about it's related to what we're talking about, but that great commission that those of us that are believers in Jesus Christ, Christian people, we hear that great commission of go and make disciples. Can you differentiate or just talk to us a little bit about not looking for actual converts or names on a list, but what is that to be that disciple of Jesus Christ?
No, that's right. For me, it's about walking it out. Like, Jesus didn't have everybody as his disciples. He had 12 men in his circle, you know what I mean? And so you don't disciple the whole crowd at the same time. And those guys are guys that you build a personal relationship. And I don't go around like, I'm not, because a lot of people will come in and they'll like beat you over the head with the Bible, and I'm not. My mentor always taught me, he's like, you should walk like you are the living embodiment of the Bible. So when people see you, especially with my contrast, I look like I've been in jail before, but when people see that joy that pours out of my smile and my heart and my behavior, people should wonder, what is different about you? Like, why are you so joyful? You've been in prison for 4 years. You should be angry and resentful and mad at the world and the government and everybody else. But it's joy comes from the Lord, which is not contingent upon circumstances or where I've been the last 4 years or any of that. That's happiness. I'm sad because I'm in jail, or I'm happy because I'm free. Joy is a constant. It should be a constant in my life. And so that living embodiment of the word is what we want to shoot for. And it should draw people in, which gives you the opportunity to share the gospel, which then allows you to build the relationships, which should lead to discipleship with the men that are willing to walk down that path. And that's accountability both ways and those types of things like that. So I'm not looking for, pats on the back or looking for I baptized this many, or I saved this many souls,
Sure.
or any of that. No, none of that. Not me. Jesus Christ does all of that. I just try to live as the walking ambassador for Christ, because he's the one that empowers the ambassador,
Yeah.
just like the
So
president.
would you have an example of a time where you had to demonstrate hope or be a voice of hope to some of the guys around you?
Yeah, for sure. So, there was a lot of, a lot of people were on an emotional roller coaster in there. And just a little simple example was when Donald Trump would speak at his rallies, and this was the whole time, right?
Yeah.
Some days he would be like, the J6 political hostages, or this, that, or the other. And everybody's, oh, he's talking about us, and we're in jail. And we're like, our hope is we're riding on Donald Trump. My faith is in Christ, but, Trump is the one that's got the keys right now to the freedom. Jesus controls it as well. But now when he would speak, it was like, oh, yes, he's talking about it. But when he wouldn't say it, man, there were some people where they're like, he didn't talk about us tonight. And it was almost like,
I get it.
we're like, look, don't kill yourself. We're going to be okay. He can't talk about us every speech. Like, y'all just be calm. Like, and I believe from the beginning, when Donald Trump gets back in office, he is going to pardon us, because he stood up. Not only did we stand up for him, none of us went to the Capitol for what to happen.
Yeah.
Happen. You know what I mean? None of us wanted that. A majority of us witnessed police brutality and these types of things, and then reacted in that moment, in that situation. And so, he knows that. We all know that our government is very proficient. And you mentioned those books, Propaganda in the Crowd. Like, they're proficient and skilled at provoking crowds, provoking police into brutality, I'm sure, or probably dressed up as police, committing acts of brutality, which then enrages further crowd members, which attack further police, which enrages them, and then they attract further crowd, and it just is like a ripple effect. So we know that our government is good at those things, those color revolutions. We saw it in, I guess it was Brazil.
Yes.
A year or two later, we saw this, and it looked like January the 6th, but in a foreign country. And I'm like, this is not an accident. So I felt like we were getting pardoned, because I didn't feel like what happened was on the up and up. And I think President Trump is, thank God, he's free thinking enough, and smart enough to understand that.
So I just shift our focus a little bit. I want to ask you about kind of the aftermath. So you've been through these 9 different prisons, not to mention previous life. How did these experiences differ? But more importantly, what kind of insights did this give you about maybe injustices within the prison system?
Well, like you said, I have a past, and I've been in Texas prison, and I've been to some of the worst prisons in the state of Texas, right? And done my time there. And what I saw from the treatment of the guards in DC to what I saw in the Federal Bureau of Prisons at the Pollock medium and the Terre Haute medium, like, blows away anything that I ever saw in the state of Texas. The federal prison system, the level of violence is off the charts. The guard on inmate violence, off the charts. Inmate on inmate violence, off the charts. The amount of drugs and paraphernalia in there is off the charts. And I thought going into the feds, they're like, oh, it's bowling alleys and putting greens and tennis courts and this, that, or the other. I'm like, well, this is going to be good, and the food's going to be better, and all these things. And you got the First Step Back and all these programs, or you'll take a trade, maybe go to college, like, utilize my time. And I get there, and it is it's a war zone in there. I witnessed over a period of about 5 months, I witnessed 2 people die. One died from a synthetic cannabinoids laced with fentanyl overdose.
Wow.
And another guy was beaten to death by his cellmate. And I watched them haul both of those dead bodies out on a stretcher. And it was like they locked us in right after that happened. And then a few hours later, they let us back out. And I'm like, if that would have happened in the state of Texas, the whole prison would have been locked down for like 90 days. They would have conducted an investigation, done their due diligence, and then let everybody back out again. The BOP, couple hours, you guys are good. And I was like, if that was me, if I would have died, they would have wheeled me out of here. It would have just been like nothing ever happened. There's this spirit of like deliberate indifference from the staff and even the inmates. And there's this wall between the two too, where the inmates, like, you can't talk to the officers because you're potentially a snitch or a rat, and the guards don't talk to the inmates because they don't want to know any problems that they're going through.
Yeah, right.
I even heard it from certain guards that work next door at the penitentiaries, and they're like, when they get off the bus over there, we tell the inmates, you better get a knife. Better yet, you better get a few of them. And I'm like, how?
Wow.
Your job is to make sure that we're safe and protected, and, and you're telling me, like, maybe from a man to man, like, hey, it's bad over here, you better get a knife. Well, how about you guys do your job and make sure nobody has a knife? How about that?
Yeah.
And so the level of, fortunately, we are at Stand in the Gap. We're going to be working on justice reform. And that's something that we have got to change, because if you put these men, like we talked about the dog in the kennel, you lock them in there and you put them in these war zones with knives and drugs and all this stuff and fighting and jumping each other and gang related stuff. Like, how do you expect them to get back out into society and be normal functioning citizens? They're going to move in next door to you, next door to me. And then what? Then our children and our wives and our communities have to absorb all of that because they've been traumatized in prison or participated in all this evil. And now that's all they know. So we've got to change that. We've got to invest in these people as human beings so they can be good neighbors, good fathers, good husbands, good churchgoers, or good employees, good entrepreneurs, or whatever it is. So,
so your story definitely emphasizes second chances. And so speaking of that freedom, being able to walk out of those prison doors, what message would you have for others who are outside now of the system and they're struggling to rebuild their lives after incarceration?
I would say, take it one step at a time. I'd put a lot of pressure on myself, and I've done it since I've been out. I had like an anxiety attack because I met one barrier after another, like trying to get my license back, and you can't just go to the DMV anymore. You got to make an appointment, and I have a truck, but now I can't get it insured, and I can't drive it because I don't have an ID. Then I've got to try to take on technology, set up a cell phone, set up a laptop, set up my Apple account, set up my email, or try to get into my old email, and just all these things. And it was like I felt like this world was just bearing down on me, and it overwhelmed me. So I would just say, seek God first. If you don't have a relationship with God, cry out to him. But if you do have a relationship with God, my mentor's wife is like, and I was getting overwhelmed, and she was like, well, have you prayed about it, Shane? And I hadn't. And so I prayed about it, and things started to unfold much more smoothly. So I would say God is the author of our steps. So I would say seek God first. And if you're having trouble, whatever it is, find a local church community, reach out to them, or find a prison ministry of somebody that knows what it's like for people to transition into society. And if things become overwhelming, man, please reach out to info at standinthegap.foundation, or I believe the number is 1-800-SAVED-J6. I believe there is a hotline for January 6 people that Jaleese and Mark Middleton have, like an emergency hotline. But I would just say that don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be discouraged. If 99 doors might get slammed in your face, but there's going to be one that's going to open for you. So I believe that God will open that door for you.
Yeah. So how can our viewers or listeners get in touch with you or some of the organizations? We'll put their websites up on the screen.
Okay. Yeah, I would say if you want to follow me on Twitter at TheRealJ6 Shane, or if you want to get in touch with the foundation, if you feel inclined to help or see what kind of programs we're offering, go to standinthegap.foundation, or go to therealj6.com, where we're going to be having hoodies and t-shirts and stickers and stuff like that. If you want to donate, by all means. We are a nonprofit, and that's how we operate, is through donations. So we would appreciate any support, 5, 10, 20, whatever it is. We would appreciate it.
Yeah, it all adds up.
Yes,
and
sir.
We'll make sure to put your contact info on the screen, because we do want people, wherever they're listening from, I should say, to help out those in need. Shane, sincere thanks for joining me today for the 5 a.m. podcast.
Yes, sir. It was an honor and a pleasure. And I'm going to get those 2 books you mentioned as well. So thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, those books absolutely changed even the way my wife and I watch movies. There's a lot of stuff we just don't even watch anymore because we think back to what Edward Bernays or Aldous Huxley would put in his writings and how they formed, Western thought, you could say. So, yeah, those will be good books. Anyway, and I want to thank our viewers and listeners too. We appreciate you being here. And after you've been kind to those helping people getting free from J6 issues, we would love it if you came over to 5 a.m. podcast. And if you can find a 5-star review opportunity for this show, we would love it. It seems like with reviews, it's either a 5 or a 0. So if you find somewhere like a podcast player that you could put a review on, please select the highest number possible. It's like all the other ones are adjacent to 0, like buying a home adjacent to Beverly Hills. Everyone knows it's not in Beverly Hills, right? And your review helps us, and we love the comments. We do respond. We'll even show some of your comments to our dog, Bailey, because, he likes to participate. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm getting off into the weeds, which is usually where my fishing lures go. One other thing I'm going to ask, ladies and gentlemen, if you could go to buymeacoffee.com/5am podcast and drop a few bucks or bills in the coffee cup, we would appreciate that. So until our next conversation, I'm Michael Klassen, and remember, it's 5 a.m. somewhere.